Welcome, everyone, to the Rogue Thoughts podcast. And today's guest is Dr. Joshua Rhodes, a lecturer and research scientist at the University of Texas in Austin. He focuses on the smart grid and the bulk electricity system, the big real world infrastructure that helps keeps the lights on. His work looks at how energy efficiency, planning, distributed generation, and how policies can help make the economy and the grid work better or worse. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Columbia University and a founding partner of Idea Smiths LLC, bringing an academic and practical approach to the issues. Welcome, Dr. Rose, to Rogue Thoughts.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Thank you for being here. So, just first off, are outages random, or are people able to predict that there can be an outage coming up?
I mean, there are certain conditions that, like, if you're talking about like electricity outages, like why people lose electricity. I mean, there are certain conditions upon which like outages become more likely. And the majority of time people lose power, it's actually because of like the distribution network going down. So like the small wires and poles that like take electricity kind of the last mile down like an alley or a street or something like that. And a lot of that is due to weather. So like inclement weather events are like the number one driver of the electricity going out. And so if you've got a big storm coming, it's more likely that the electricity would go out versus there being some kind of like larger systemic issue like not enough power plants to meet supply. Um, yeah, and so I mean, this distribution system, the smaller wires and poles are generally the biggest reason. And when it's weather events, you can kind of predict that things might happen. But sometimes things are kind of random. I mean, sometimes like, and actually, a surprisingly large percentage of times when people lose power is because of cars hitting poles. And you know, that one's going to be a little bit harder to predict.
Would you say our current grid system is unreliable?
I mean, I think that there's room for improvement. I mean, if you look at like, there's a couple of metrics, SAIDI and SAFI, that kind of like measure like the amount of time you have an outage and like the duration of those outages. And in some parts of the country, those metrics are getting worse. Um, and you know, as the grid is looking to kind of grow into the future with like all this, you know, demand for data centers and other types of things, like I mean, that will put more stress on the system. And so, you know, things if we don't if we're not smart about upkeeping, replacing, doing the maintenance that we need to do, I mean, things could get worse. But like in the U.S., the grid is generally pretty strong. There's going to be parts that are going to be worse than others, but you know, in general, it is pretty good. Although there's quite a bit of room for improvement, and yeah, we're going to do a lot of improvement actually if we want to, um, you know, meet the keep the reliability standards or actually exceed the reliability standards that we've got, while also incorporating a lot of this new load.
You mentioned there's room for improvements. If you had to pick two of the biggest improvements that are needed, what are they?
Yeah, so a couple. So I'm also electric utility commissioner for Austin Energy. It's one of the biggest municipal utilities kind of in the U.S. And so I see this from kind of like not only like the big grid side, but all the, you know, down to the distribution kind of network. I mean, like one of the biggest issues we have is just vegetation management. Um, and that's just making sure that you know, trees, other types of, you know, plants and things like that aren't, you know, climbing up the poles or hanging over the poles, because when that inclement weather comes around, ice storms or windstorms or, you know, things like that, I mean, those are the types of you know, conditions that make it more likely. Now sometimes you can run into you know, pushback for people who don't want you trimming trees. Austin actually ran into this issue a few years ago. There was a lot of pushback against trimming some of the trees kind of in the western part of town. And so a lot of vegetation grew a lot bigger than it should have. And then we had a big ice storm, and a lot of folks on that side of town lost power. And so we've since stepped up our you know, our ability to go out there and do that kind of thing. And what, so I think vegetation management, all while it's not maybe the most sexy of things, like it's a pretty, but it is kind of like it is one of those maintenance things that like just like really needs to be done to, to make sure that the grid is that the grid is strong. And there's other, more active things like, dynamic line ratings and other types of things like that, tech-based solutions that can help us squeeze more out of the system than we currently get. Um, but but yeah, I mean, just honestly, it's like a lot of it is just basic maintenance and hardening the system to make sure that it's able to withstand the events that nature throws at it.
Besides individuals opposing tree trimming, is there any other basic maintenance that you feel gets overlooked?
I mean, it kind of depends on where you are. I mean, there's, some famous examples like, from California a few years ago, some of the, not replacing hooks holding conductors and leading to fires that, burn whole towns and unfortunately kill people. There's just a lot of there's a lot of maintenance, like that. And in that area is a particularly windy area. And so the wind, vibrates the components, which makes them like fail faster. But then the wind is also driving the fires once they do happen. So there's a lot of like, it's a lot of that kind of thing kind of depends on where you are. If you're like along the coast, then you're more likely to have like a hurricane or other things like that. Making sure that your system is resilient against those types of winds. Maybe considering burying some of the infrastructure, particularly the last mile kind of infrastructure. As a way of getting it outside of the weather's um, grasp. And so I think it really does depend on where you are and what the challenges that like your local system is faces.
So for the grid, if I'm not mistaken, four layers to the grid. There's the generation, the transmission, the distribution, and then market and the rules that apply to the market. Is that correct?
Yeah, for is like yeah, for like the high level grid. Sometimes like there's another layer. There's like depending on where you are, this has different from different states in the US to different countries. Like you might have like competition at the generation level where power plants are competing. Generally, the transmission system is a regulated entity, so it's a monopoly. And then you may or may not have like competition on the retail side of things. And so the people who manage the wires and the poles outside of your house might not be the same people that pay your electricity bill to every month. In some places, it's all the same. It's all the same person, or it's all the same company. It's called a vertically integrated system, and that's how electricity was up until the last couple decades when we got into unbundling and things like deregulation. Places like Texas and somewhat in California and some other places uh, around the U.S. But in general, yeah, there's generators, there's transmission, then there's distribution, and then there's a whole host of like other um, you know financial players kind of in that space.
Which stage would you say is the most critical stage?
I mean, they all need to be there to work, right? I mean, it's like it's a continuous like system, and so if any part of it goes down, then you result in not getting power out the other side, right? If the power plants aren't operating because they're either frozen or flooded or can't get fuel, then nothing's going to go on the transmission network. If a hurricane takes down transmission lines like we've seen around Entergy before and like around New Orleans, like you can take the big wires and poles can't move the power, but like you know the part that is the most susceptible is generally the distribution side. And so like, but it's also like the hardest one because it's like the most diffuse. There's like the most miles of it. Like there's something like 250,000 miles of transmission lines and over 5 million miles of like distribution lines. And so there's just a whole lot more of them. And so it's in terms of like which one probably needs the most like attention, I mean, probably the distribution network, but you really need all pieces of it there, and they all have their individual strengths and weaknesses.
So just so our viewers can understand how it works, or I should say, how electricity gets to their homes, it starts at the generational level from a large grid and then transmits to those distributors we all see that are like standing up on the ceilings and the roads and things like that, and then gets to their home, correct?
Yeah, so I mean, and there's, even that is like a little bit of like, has been changing over time, right? So like historically, yeah, you would have like big centralized generators. They'd make electricity. They would put that at a very high voltage onto the transmission network, and then the power would go down the transmission network, and then it would go through substations and transformers where the voltage would be dropped all the way down to, if you're in North America, 110 volts before it hits like your the wall socket in your house. If you're in Europe, it's 220. But generally, you're starting at 345,000 volts and other types. So you're starting at much higher levels of power in the big lines before stepping down and being transformed all the way down to where we can consume it. And so there's multiple pieces kind of that go kind of along that way. But there's distributed energy resources now, right? So individual homes can have solar panels that they can be making the electricity kind of right on top of where they're consuming it, or putting it in a battery, or charging a battery from the grid and then using that later, or having all kinds of distributed generation. So the bulk of electricity is still comes through kind of the centralized generators, kind of the big ones we're talking about, but like there's an ever growing amount that is also being kind of like generated at the grid edge, and or what we call distributed energy resources.
On those large grids, there are three of them, if I'm not mistaken, in the U.S. The East, the coast, the West, and then Texas has its own, right?
Yes, excuse me. Um, the grid is sliced and diced in a whole bunch of different ways, and but kind of in the US there are three what we call interconnects. These are pieces of the grid that are operating at the same frequency, but within those interconnects, like within the eastern interconnect, you might have the mid-continent independent system operator, or MISO, southern power pool, or SPP, CERC, which is the southeast regional coordinator, PJM, ISO New England, ISO New York. Like you've got these other kind of like smaller aggregations of grids that are kind of doing more of the market part behind the market side of the electricity, but they're in the same interconnect in terms of like the power plants in Florida are operating at the same hertz as power plants in, say, Pennsylvania or other places. But yeah, but yes, writ large in the US, we have three major grids: the Eastern Interconnect, which is basically the Rocky Mountains East; the Western Interconnect, which is the Rocky Mountains West; and then we have ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which is wholly contained within the state of Texas. It doesn't take up the entire state of Texas. Parts of Texas are in other grids, but ERCOT is wholly contained within the state.
So just for the viewers, ERCOT kind of operates on its own, like it doesn't really subscribe to the things that the East and the West connect. They kind of are their own marketplace, right?
Yeah, so one of the things that's unique about ERCOT is that because it doesn't cross state lines, it doesn't trigger the Interstate Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which doesn't put it under as much federal jurisdiction. It's not like it's completely outside the bounds of like the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, which is kind of a standard setting body. But in general, its regulation of its market, of kind of how it operates, is left to the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and it doesn't really have to take cues in terms of how its market functions from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, which oversees electricity in all the other regions where it crosses state lines. So FERC oversees those other regions because electricity as that commodity crosses state lines, triggers interstate commerce clause, but that's just not the case with ERC.
Do you think with ERCOT existing that other states might consider copying that idea and creating their own kind of energy systems, or is that not sustainable?
I mean, it would be. Possible. You'd have to sever parts of the grid from each other. I mean, or or at least convert the connections that cross state lines into direct current power. Because Texas is actually technically connected to other regions, but instead of it being alternating current at the same frequency, it is first converted into direct current, and then excuse me, it's first converted into direct current, and then that direct current is what is moved across state lines and then is reconverted back into alternating current. And FERC has decided that that doesn't count as interstate commerce, and so you would have other states would have to replicate something similar to that. But I think most places, I mean, the institutional inertia are kind of around how things are going. Like, I think it would take a really big type of event to like a really big bad type of event um, uh, before that would happen.
ERCOT, do you think it's operating efficiently, or do you think there are ways that it could be reformed and it could be operating way better?
Yeah, I mean, I think ERCOT is actually one of the more efficient and dynamic markets like out there. ERCOT's an energy only market, it does not have a capacity market, and so that what that generally means is that power plants are only paid when they produce electricity, whereas in other regions that have capacity markets, power plants can be paid just to be available to produce electricity. And if you're going to pay someone to be available to produce electricity, you have to make kind of like an administrative choice as to how much of that you want to procure. And that becomes this quasi out of market mechanism that is not as well defined by market dynamics as like an energy only market, which is sending real time price signals and other types of things like that for what types of capacity and what types of energy sources are helpful and useful. And I mean, in general, ERCOT can build transmission like twice as fast as other regions. One of this is because we don't have to abide by FERC rules and regulations, things like that. We generally can build power plants much faster. ERCOT has built a lot more generation than a lot of other regions because we allow new new players to come to the market. And if those new players, if those new generators that come to the market are more efficient and edge out older, less efficient incumbents, like we allow that to happen. Whereas some other regions, if they're fully integrated, you might not want that to happen. Like if you're in the Southeast US and you have a vertically integrated utility and that utility decides to build a power plant, and it turns out that power plant was just not a good idea, like the technology changes, the fuel changes, like whatever, like generally the ratepayers are going to be saddled with the cost of that power plant for its lifetime, and the utility is going to be remiss to retire it or sell it or do something different with it because they had to pay for it. Whereas in ERCOT, if you build a power plant that is not a good fit for the market, um, your shareholders are going to be the ones uh, who bear that risk, and in general, other better suited operators may come take your market share. But that allows for a more dynamic and kind of a faster evolution of the system, and it generally drives more efficiencies that way because the market's going to tend towards more efficient outcomes.
So with that said, would you say ERCOT is a way that other states should copy? Like, for example, New York, or New York City specifically, Con Edison is the only electrical company there. Do you think that makes it harder for the consumer to even challenge the marketplace, as in like they're essentially a monopoly and that stops any type of innovation in that city?
I mean, I think you're less likely to see like innovation if you don't have like direct rewards for that innovation, right? And so like that's the way we've set our market up down here is like we reward like new low cost consumers, and so the market tends to like you know um, pull those things in. If there is no reward, in fact, it may be that there's a disincentive or a negative reward for adopting new technology if that means you have to get rid of the old technology that you already spent money on, whether that's your ratepayers get mad or the politicians get mad or other types of things like that. Um, you can end up in a um, situation, like that. So I mean, I think it's kind of like, follow the incentives. We offer high levels of incentives down here in areas that don't have high levels of incentives. Like I think you'd see less, uh, you'd see less innovation.
Energy, there's a lot of renewable energies that are coming about and new ways to create energy, solar, hydro, nuclear even, and I think another one I'm familiar with, CHP. Which one of those do you think is the most realistic to the country that we can use?
I mean, I think like, no energy source is perfect. Like everything, there's trade-offs in every single one. Um, one of the things about like renewables, like wind and solar, is if the wind's not blowing or sun's not shining, you're not going to be able to make, energy like that. They've got off switches, but they don't always have the on switch that you might want. Now you compare that with energy storage, which is what is happening now, and you can kind of firm up that generation. So you can store the energy whenever it's being produced, and then like actually put it to the grid whenever it wants to be consumed. And so there's, those types of give and take. But if that combination of those resources is too expensive, then things like natural gas, combined heat and power, like you're talking about, like other types of things, like probably still going to be needed in the uh, in the near term future, unless we figure out nuclear or other types of stuff like that. But when looking at like, if you look at like around the country, like in all the interconnection queues and what is trying to get built, I mean, a lot of that is solar and storage. And I would argue that one of the reasons why we're seeing like a lot of solar and storage is it's just a very modular technology. It's like, you can take the actual unit of like, of solar is a solar panel, and that's something that, a single person can carry around, and you can mass produce them in factories. And the same thing with batteries, the modules and like the units and all those things. I mean, generally you can get them down to the point where like the component parts of them are able to be just put out of factories, and you don't need big specialized uh, uh, factories or other types of things to do that. And so if you want to build 130 megawatts of solar or 132 megawatts of solar, like that's a really easy change to make. You're not going to be able to get 200 megawatts of gas turbine, but then get 203. You're not going to be able to like get them in the same amount of like, increments as easily as you would with, something like solar. And we've seen this actually in other technologies as well. In general, we're not building like the large, big units like we used to, like the gigawatt scale, like the big coal plant, big nuclear plant stuff. We're building things in smaller chunks. We've been doing that with natural gas turbines and other types of technologies. And that's why you're seeing kind of this like push towards, things like small modular nuclear and other things like that too.
For nuclear, just out of curiosity, is the biggest concern that what happens if that nuclear waste leaks out, or is it more so that where can they put the nuclear plant to power everything in a way where it won't harm anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the things is like with nuclear is like, uh, you know, the disasters are scary events. They're big, they impact big footprints, and they have kind of large impacts on people. I mean, I think like the thing with nuclear, but attitudes towards nuclear I think are changing. In fact, like a lot of like with the younger demographics, like the attitudes towards nuclear are changing. I think kind of in a recognition of like we need firm, clean power on the system, and nuclear doesn't have any emissions associated with the generation of electricity, and that's not just carbon emissions, but that's criteria air pollutant emissions that create things like smog and acid rain and other types of things like that, like other fuels can, like coal and natural gas. And so, I, but the thing is like the old way of building like nuclear is we would build big gigawatt scale plants, And we really stopped doing that in like the 1980s, and our domestic supply chains really atrophied. In fact, there's only like one place in the world that can forge the containment dome to go onto the top of these like big nuclear facilities, like the big AP-1000s, and it's in South Korea. Like we don't even have all of the supply chain here to be able to do that. And so, and because these are big gigawatt scale plants, like the risk that companies take in deploying those is big. And like I was talking about with solar and other types of things, the name of the game has gone modular. It's gotten smaller, going up for smaller chunks that maybe you can kind of squeeze together. And so, um, one of the things, and so that is also where people are trying to take nuclear, trying to do SMRs or small modular reactors, to be able to get them to the point where you can build them inside of factories and take on less capital risk. And so, I mean, I think a lot of it right now is like we just haven't built them, and so we haven't we, well we haven't built many of the big plants in a while, and we've never built one of the smaller ones in terms of like a commercial grade operations system. There's pilots and other types of things like that that are happening, but it's kind of like a chicken and an egg type thing. Is like our you know ha, you know the industry wants to see that it works before it invests in it, but you need money to show that it works, or you need investment to show that it works. And so it's kind of like this is, I think, where government is, should be the one who steps in to kind of bootstrap a couple of these things, just like we did with the original, nuclear power plants, 50 plus years ago.
What what to you would that government intervention look like? Is it through tax incentives or just giving
Order
them the
books.
I'm sorry?
No, I mean, order books. I mean, I think it's like, I think the companies need, um, like, to get 100 ordered on the books to be able to get the financials in place to build their factories, get their supply chains in order, and like start making them. Like you're not going to be able to do all of that infrastructure just for one. Like, and if someone's going to invest in that infrastructure when you've only got one on the order book, like they're taking a huge risk, right? But if the government comes in and says, okay, we'll build the first 50, and then we'll build like we'll pay for half of the second 50 or something like that, then you really start to be able to kind of line up you know um, all the other supply chains. You start to get the labor force, like all these other things that you need, like to be able to operate the system. Like it's not something you can just spin up tomorrow.
Just on the supply chain point, even the current electrical grid infrastructure has a supply chain problem. Is that right?
Mhm. Yeah, everything's more expensive than it was just 5 years ago.
And how do we combat that? I've read that a lot of the parts come from overseas. Is that because America is not giving the incentives needed to keep those parts and infrastructure here, or is it because that those parts are require so much manual labor, so much it's easier to outsource it?
I mean, in general, it's happened because it's cheaper, right? And so, like a lot of our transformers, like come from Mexico. A lot of our power poles and things like that in the U.S. come from Canada. They also happen to have a lot of the lodgepole pines that are good for those types of things. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, it's just other countries that generally are edging us out on either like the raw materials or in terms of or in the labor. Like I think the US only has the ability to manufacture about 20% of like the transformers that we need. Uh, and so we have to import 80% of that. Unfortunately, a lot of that has tariffs on it right now, which is making it even more expensive to do that. But yeah, I mean, it's just like I mean, a lot of that has come from, free trade agreements and just like general offshoring of, manufacturing. Some of that, which is trying to come back though.
Microgrids. Would microgrids help the system as a whole, or is that something that is just almost like a luxury for people who want to power their own house on their own?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it as kind of two ways. I mean, yes, there is that, but I mean, I think like I think you're always going to be able to wring more efficiencies out of like a larger connected system and a bigger system in terms of getting like the unit cost of like like electricity down or keeping it as low as possible. And so if you have to get all the stuff that makes the electricity, that moves electricity, that balances the system, that does all that thing, if you have to replicate that over and over again, like I I I don't think you're able to realize the economies of scale that you get with like the larger grid. Now, that being said, I think there are certain instances where I think we're willing to pay more for like energy, and because well, we're willing to pay more for things like microgrids because we value the resilience over just the low cost energy. So things like hospitals and nursing homes and like, police stations and fire stations and things like that. Like we want to make sure that even if the grid goes down, that those essential services and things like that are able to still function. And so we, might be willing to, build microgrids for those types of for that type of for those types of uses, because we're willing to pay more, we're willing to pay a premium for that resilience.
Just my bad. Would you mind explaining really quickly what a microgrid is to the audience?
Yeah, so a microgrid is essentially it's just a miniature version of like the macro grid or the grid, as it were. So microgrid is it contains all the components of the grid, but just in a smaller form and in a smaller footprint. And so you've got, generation, whether that's, a generator or solar and storage or whatever, but then you've also got, the distribution, being able to move that energy around like the building or the neighborhood or whatever it is that you've built the microgrid around. And then, you've got pieces on there that are changing the voltage and transforming up and, making sure that you're balancing the system, you're balancing supply and demand kind of on the system and keeping it stable and secure. But it's just all of the components that are in or most of the components that are in the big grid, just, kind of at the smaller scale.
And you're more of a proponent of the bigger grid handling traffic than having more microgrids.
I mean, I think for the vast majority of electricity, I think it makes the most sense. Um, uh, because it costs the least amount of sense, because it's cheaper. Um, I think it's going to be cheaper, but it's like, but it, for like individual homes or whatever, people have to like figure out what their value of resilience is. And so if you lose power often, and you can't work without having, electricity, like you might value that resilience really high. And so you might want to put in like, a microgrid that's able to go to keep you powered while, the if the bigger grid is, not as reliable as you'd like. But I don't think it's something that we would want to replace the bigger grid with like microgrids. I know some people do, but I don't think that that would be the most efficient way of doing it.
With society growing and demand growing too for power, AI, EVs, Bitcoin mining, things like that, is the demand outpacing the supply? And if it is, how do we catch up to that supply?
Yeah, I mean, right now in certain areas, it definitely looks like that. And if you look at like the number of data centers and things like that that are looking to, connect to the system, particularly in a place like Texas, like um, Texas where I'm at, like the ERCOT grid peaks at about 85 gigawatts or 85 and a half gigawatts, and there's currently 225 gigawatts worth of data centers that would like to come online before 2030. And now there's just physically no way that the grid can grow that fast. Like it took us well over 100 years to get to 85 and a half gigawatts, and we're not going to like triple that in 5 years, right? It's just like we can't deploy enough steel fast. There's not enough people to, even if we had it laying around, there's not enough people to install it like in the scale upon which it would take um, to get there. And generally, like the grid is not going to allow load to connect if it's going to destabilize the system. And so I think it'll make the grid tighter, like with the deployment of all this infrastructure. I mean, I do think costs are going to go up. If you look at like, you know, the like in ERCOT, just because it's what I know the best, there's 250 gigawatts of large load that wants to, sorry, 225 gigawatts of large load that wants to connect to the system, and we've got about 280 gigawatts of like supply in the interconnection queue. Now, most of that is solar and wind and sorry, most of that is solar and storage, with a little bit of wind and gas, as well. But I don't think it would produce enough energy for all of like the data centers that want to connect, to the system. So um, right now, it looks like demand, or like projected demand, is vastly like outpacing supply. But when it comes down to like the day-to-day operations of the grid, like I don't think we will let the grid go dark because we just connect too many things. Like at least we're a little bit smarter than that, I would hope. But yeah, but there's large interest in putting new demands on the system, and so we need to build a lot of new supply.
How would building that new supply look? Is that more transmitters, more big stations, more substations,
All of
or
it,
all
every
of
bit
it?
of it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's every bit of it, because I mean, you need all of that. You need the power plants, you need the transformers, you need the substations, you need the switchgear, you need the distribution, you need all the pieces, the poles, everything, to be able to grow at the scale at which like it wants to grow.
And of those three, do you think that the AI and the data storages require the most electricity by far, or is it pretty balanced between that, EVs and Bitcoin mining farms coming up now too?
I mean, I think in general, like the utilization factors, like how often is the demand, consuming the electricity. I mean, I think a lot, like right now, it's still early days, but a lot of these like AI training and inference, data centers are consuming the a lot of energy. So they have a really high utilization factor. They're paying tens of thousands of dollars per chip, and so like they want to keep the chips operating like as often as possible. I think it's somewhere like the the lost, like 1 megawatt, like a data center would value not having 1 megawatt at $4 to $12 million per year. Like if you have a 1 year delay, like a megawatt is, you're losing $4 to $12 million. And so if you look at a gigawatt data center, that's like $1.2 billion like lost like per year if like you're not able to operate that. And so the the perceived value of the product coming out of the data center is so much higher than the cost of the electricity, like going in, that is one of the reasons you're seeing like this huge rush like into the market uh of these data centers. But once they get in there, they they want to operate, they want to run more or less continuously.
Do you think because of how big that cost is, that is going to increase the likelihood of bad policy and bad infrastructure, or will it increase it in a way where it'll make it more efficient and better?
I mean, I think one of the problems right now is like we just don't have a firm grasp on how much of this is real and how much of it is not. But we're having like we're not going to get 225 gigawatts of data centers in ERCOT in Texas by 2030. Like it's just not going to happen. But, we're making policy around those types of numbers. And so like if we make policy around of gigawatts of data centers and it turns out it's really only 35 gigawatts of data centers, well, we have made the wrong decisions like going forward. And so I think it's a real, I think the problem right now is just we just don't know like how much of this is real and how much of it is not. Like I mean, I'm on the record calling it a bubble. One for like I just you can't grow this fast, and so like this number is going to pop at some point. Now, anytime a bubble pops, there's still froth there. There is going to be growth. There is going to be the use of like I mean, my students are using AI to cheat on their homework, all this kind of stuff. Like we're using it, like right, like it's being used, and so there's demand for it. But like, um, is it? But getting a handle on like how big that number is. I mean, that's a tough one.
It's tough because you think of how much is being poured in right now, all that electricity and everything in general, and like you said, it might even be a bubble. I agree with you a little bit on that. So do you think that it is better to overestimate it or underestimate the amount that you need for it?
I mean, probably best to overestimate it, but probably not best to overestimate it by two or three times. Like it's, you generally, wanna fall kind of like, a little bit on the like the high side, but I mean that only works to a certain point, right? Um, because if we build all of the infrastructure, the transformers, the lines, the everything that to connect 225 gigawatts of data centers, like that eventually has to be paid for. It's not like if the data center doesn't show up that you get your money back for that. Like that's steel in the ground, and and ratepayers have to pay for that. And so that's what I mean by like we need like if we don't get a policy handle on this type of thing, like um, we run the risk of like building stranded infrastructure that we still have to pay for. Um, there's no, you know, no one's doing this for free.
Said, how much does the end dollar amount affect the policy?
I mean, the numbers almost feel like magical right now, or like just not real, right? I mean, like you've got OpenAI talking about $1 trillion like worth of capex spend. I mean, like what does that even mean? I mean, you could get how many square foot of data center that would be, but um, it's just so far like above kind of what like we've, you know, known like in the past. It's just hard to get a grasp around that, right? I mean, that's like what the US, what is US GDP, $7 trillion or something like that. I'm probably getting that wrong, but um, like it's a non-insignificant chunk of that, right? um of total spend. So I just don't know that you know it's like if someone wins $1 billion in the lottery. I mean, it's just like if you went from nothing to $1 billion, like you just don't, it's just hard. Not many people would know how to like
Manage
actually
it.
manage that, right? um because it's different. Winning $100 is like most people can manage that, but winning $1 billion, like a lot of people couldn't, right? It's just like outside the scale.
If you were put in charge, then how would you handle this whole situation? Since you have a very real world assessment of it, not where we need to build all of this right away and meet all these numbers and that, how would you handle the situation?
So, I mean, right now in this acute situation where of like large loads and data centers like wanting to connect to the system, like I would set up a system where like the new large loads pay for the infrastructure that they need to connect to the system, and then they can get paid back over like a 10 or 15-year period or something like that. So if they exist for that long. And so like if you have a data center that like sticks around and is like operational for 15 years, like they fully get paid back for like the infrastructure, for like the money that they had to put out to like build the infrastructure to connect them to the system. And so it's like, but if we're kind of in a bubbly type situation and some of these we build out the infrastructure and the data center like either doesn't show up or like is only there for 2 years or something like that, then they don't get paid the full amount back, right? They just get paid back the amount that they existed and were buying electricity from the system. And I just think that that protects like it can do a better job of protecting like ratepayers, like so they're not saddled with like a bunch of infrastructure cost. You know, one, not saddled with all of it right away, but two, if this is a bubble and things pop, that they're not saddled with that cost at all.
Have you seen that policy been used anywhere at all?
That policy is in use in the Alberta system operator for generators. It's a guac. I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but like the Alberta Energy's AESO like utilizes a policy like that for generators. They may be considering it for loads. Did some work in Alberta and like suggested it, but also have like tried to. I mean, talking about it down here.
And has that been efficient in the way it's been implemented, or is it too early to tell?
I mean, I think it's worked well in Alberta. It's just, but it's not in place here for loads. We're still like everyone else trying to figure out how that's going to happen, and it's going to be a big fight.
What what do you think is one myth that people think about our infrastructure that is wrong?
Um, I mean, a lot of times when people, particularly in Texas since Winter Storm Uri, whenever like the power goes out, they kind of blame either ERCOT or the generators or other types of things. But like the vast majority of times that people lose power, it's like the local stuff, like the distribution lines, the local transformers, the pole mount, the stuff like up on the poles that you were talking about earlier. And so it's kind of like politics in general. Like everyone likes to pay attention to like federal politics, but it's like, it's like it's your city council where like most of like the decisions that directly affect you are made. And like it's similar in like the electricity sector. Like a lot of people want to blame like the big name brand like group, whether that's NISO or Con Ed or whatever, but it's like the small stuff, the stuff that's closer to you that actually matters.
What do you think a young engineer should know or learn right now if they want to fix the grid?
Um, I mean, I think a lot of I think a lot of it, two buckets. One is like there's two paths. One, like having the technical chops to be able to like model the system to understand like how power flows through like through networks at like in the weeds, but also kind of at the high level, like understanding how the markets work, understanding how like that whole like system works. Um, be- because I mean, I was talking to a major utility in Houston the other day, and they said that like you know 3 years ago, they would have like large load studies like one at a time. And anytime they get these large loads like wanting to connect, they've got to model the system to make sure that they can incorporate it, that it can be stable. They said, 3 years ago they would have had one at a time. They've got 100 simultaneous like studies like right now, and so they've hired like everybody who works inside is busy. Every consultant they can hire is working on these things, and so like just the understanding kind of the system and how to model it um, is I think a skill that is not necessarily um, you know going to go away, and it's not also something that large language models are very good at in terms of like the optimization and kind of like uh, the synthesis and understanding of that.
Where would you like to see the grid in the next 5 years, and where do you think it's going to end up in the next 5 years?
I mean, I'd like to see the grid like continue to deploy like the resources that we've been deploying recently. Um, and that's a lot of storage, a lot of solar, a lot of other types of these resources. I think we have the wherewithal and the ability to like to manage and those types of resources now really well. Um, I I think we're going to see like a lot of really expensive natural gas plants being built. One, because like I don't think anyone's going to build a coal plant. Like there's not a single one under construction in the entire country, and like I don't think there really ever will be one again because it's just an outdated technology. Um, but like I I think we're going to build a lot of expensive natural gas because like natural gas power plants cost about double what they did like about 5 years ago. Um, and a lot of that is because of some of that's because of supply chain issues. Other thing is because of just the massive amount of like demand for this infrastructure because of like utilities all putting in orders and things like that for these systems. And I know if you're not already in line for a natural gas power plant, you're not going to get it until the 2030s now. Like the order books are already 5+ years backed up, and the prices are more than double what they were. But I think we'll see a lot of that well, I think we'll see quite a bit of that come in kind of like as that supply chain eases. Um, but that might also be at a similar time when like we figure out for real whether how much of this AI stuff is real.
Um, I guess we'll call this the closing questions. If viewers remembered one thing from this interview about the grid and how it works, what would you like them to remember?
Um, I mean, I think it's like it's not always like the flashiest things that make the most difference. Like sometimes it's the boring stuff, like vegetation management and like the small wires and poles, um, but like that matter the most. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's like I mean, at the end of the day, it's like it's about getting the energy to where like it can be put to best use, right? I mean, because no one actually wants like the energy. They want the things that energy can give them, right? You want like the computing power, you want the lights, you want the proverbial, hot showers and cold beers like type situation, right? And so, but what actually gets us those things is, not always the sexiest and the flashiest parts.
Thank you. That was great. Is there any last words you would like to leave with?
Uh, I think we have all the high notes. Yeah, that's all I can think
Awesome.
of.
Thank you everyone for joining us on the Road Thoughts podcast. And remember, this is Dr. Joshua Rhodes from University of Texas. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.